How are bilateral relations between China and Europe, and can they weather ongoing geopolitical tensions and economic uncertainty? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. This year marks 50 years since the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and the European Union. Since that time, relations have developed and deepened despite global conflicts and economic uncertainties and the recently imposed tariffs by Washington. We begin with a look at the robust strategic partnership that has strengthened trade, connectivity and reliability. CGTN's Ken Brown has this report from Barcelona.
It's one of the most important seaports in Europe, handling millions of tons of cargo and welcoming millions of cruise ship passengers each year. Now the port of Barcelona is getting another upgrade, a brand new electric vehicle shipping and logistics terminal. Set to be operational by 2027, it will strengthen Barcelona's status as an automotive hub. The expansion here at the Príncipe de España dock is worth around $75 million and is strategically placed, connecting maritime, road and rail routes, giving Chinese car makers a direct line to southern and central Europe. Fully automated, fully electrified, the silo will have capacity for close to 10,000 vehicles and will be topped by solar panels generating its own energy on site, part of carbon neutral goals. Forecasts are that it will move some 180,000 cars per year by 2028, many of them from Chinese EV companies. But while sustainability and automation are key, Barcelona will also benefit in other ways.
We believe that it's not just the place like just to land and delivery, but it can create a whole ecosystem around it. We want to position it ourselves as a region to develop this industry. We believe that there's a lot of opportunities, not just about the distribution, but also about maintenance, services, other industries that we can create around the port and everything. So yeah, for us, it's a great opportunity.
In 2023, the Port of Barcelona imported close to 800,000 cars and soon expects to receive many more thanks to this new state-of-the-art terminal, helping accelerate Spain and Europe's green transition. Ken Brown, CGTN, Barcelona.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from London, Vicky Pryce is an international economist and business consultant. And from Berlin, we're joined by Ulrich Bruckner. He is the Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. Thank you to both of you for being with us. Ulrich Bruckner, let me start with you. As I said, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and the European Union. Of course, China also maintains very close relations with a number of European member states. These are bilateral relationships. This is a relationship that has been very resilient and it's weathered many challenges. To what do you attribute that, given that we are now seeing rising geopolitical tensions and all these uncertainties that I've been talking about?
Well, we have been talking about the phenomenon of globalization in the last decades, and that has directly to do with the economic rise of China. And both sides, the European Union and China, greatly benefited from a more globalized trade relationship. And that is the reason why countries that are very export-driven, like the country that I know best and where I'm currently in Berlin, that greatly benefited from the fact that there is such a close relationship. Now things have changed and we live in different geopolitical conditions, and therefore everything is becoming more securitized, and that makes the happy relationship to focus on high growth rates and mutual economic benefits a much more complex picture, because it's not just the trade people who discuss this, but it's also military and internal security and those who are afraid that their competitiveness is at risk.
Would it be fair to say, Ulrich, that the concept of multilateralism is being threatened?
That is fair to say, but less so from the partners that we are currently discussing. But there are global tensions, and the current biggest threat at the moment comes not from China or the European Union. It comes from the new administration in the United States. They challenge the current system of a WTO rule-based global system of multilateralism, and therefore it needs common action, not only from the two partners, but from the rest of the world that stands for 85% of global trade, to protect a system that was so beneficial for everyone involved.
Right, Vicky Pryce, good to see you. Welcome to the show. Europe and China have a very robust economic relationship. The EU is China's second largest trading partner. That was in the first 5 months of this year. And annual trade has increased. It's now worth $785.8 billion. How would you characterize the trade relationship? How significant is it?
It's very important. If you look at the flow of goods, I mean, in the EU itself, in terms of the imports from China, as you rightly say, there has been actually quite an increase. And one of the areas, of course, where China has done rather well, apart from of course, talking about rare earth metals or minerals, which have been right now contested a little bit because of the relationship between China and the US. The EU has benefited from those imports, and also, of course, it has imported huge numbers of electric vehicles from China, and it has exported quite a lot of vehicles itself. So yes, a big trading relationship there, but it has certainly come under some sort of stress. First of all, we've seen that the EU itself has imposed tariffs on electric vehicles, something it hadn't done before. And then just very recently, we have a 45% tariff, which has been imposed on them. There is a concern that perhaps the way in which this trade relationship has developed, there has been an imbalance because of concern about subsidies, possibly, in China, which have affected the competitiveness of production in the EU. And therefore, things are getting a little bit strained.
Yeah, those challenges that you talk about, Vicky, they are under discussion right now by both sides. We will see what comes out of that. But I want to look at another aspect of the relationship, and that is connectivity and how it impacts the trade relationship. The China-Europe freight rail network has connections now in 229 cities in 26 European countries. So far, it's transported more than $450 billion worth in goods. How much of a game changer is this in terms of trade and reliability and expansion?
Well, I think it's a very important part of what's been going on, and you're right that there are discussions going on, and there's going to be a summit of some sort to look at the future trade relationship, which is happening in the second half of July, and that is going to be taking place in Beijing. So there's an awful lot of connectivity, if you like, that perhaps can be improved as a result of that meeting that will take place. And of course, as we know, the head of the European Central Bank is also in Beijing right now discussing about better relationships on the services side. So yes, I think making sure that those trading routes are easier and cheaper and therefore bring sort of goods around a lot more effectively is a very, very important part of what I think will be a foundation for better trade.
Ulrich, let's talk about one of the very important bilateral relationships, and that's the relationship between China and Germany. I mean, we're talking about the world's second and third largest economies, and together they contribute 1/5 of the global economy. I mean, they also had bilateral trade of just over $200 billion. How vital is this relationship for Europe, especially when you look at it against the background of these tariffs that are being imposed by the United States?
Well, it is massively affected because no matter what the outcome of the negotiations with the Trump administration is, it will have trade redirecting consequences. And if trade moves to other parts of the world, then it also depends on Is this a part of the world that's already massively affected by the Belt and Road Initiative of China or by the Global Gateway alternative of the European Union? If we talk about bilateral relations, we also have to keep in mind that although Germany is such a big export nation, trade relations are not bilateral. These are European Union competences, and it's not always a perfect match. What's in the interest of Germany is not necessarily in the best interest of the European Union. When we only look at car manufacturing, there isn't much else but German car manufacturers in the European Union. So if this is not of general interest of the EU, it is the backbone of the German export model, and therefore we will see very interesting negotiations with conflicting interests coming up.
And Vicky, looking at the future, looking at about those negotiations that Ulrich just spoke about, I mean, despite all these tensions that we do see, China has welcomed the European Council President, Antonio Costa, and the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, to China. The visit will probably happen next month. What kind of signal does that send?
Well, in a world where we're having some serious worries about trade with the US, I think the EU more generally and the UK itself, of course, is looking at making sure that the trading partners we've got are, if anything, more committed to trade with us. And I think that's basically where we are now. I think the world has definitely changed. There is no doubt that the assumptions that we have made before about how trade was going to be conducted have proved not to be true, and therefore the intention, I'm sure, from the EU more generally and also from the UK, is to ensure that the relationship with China improve. There is no doubt, though, there are some concerns. I think it was mentioned earlier, whether it's security concerns and where exactly perhaps some of the investment that everyone hopes will be moving in both directions happens, and where there may be some restrictions. But opening up of China itself and welcoming more investment from the EU and also the UK is going to be in itself quite a positive step forward. And I think a rethink of where that investment could be going and how they could be a win-win, I think, is something that everyone is looking for right now.
Okay, Vicky, Pryce, Ulrich, Bruckner, thanks to both of you for being with us. To continue our conversation, Liang joins us from New York. She is Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. And from Beijing, we're joined by Andy Mock. He is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Good to see the two of you. Thanks for being with us. Andy Mock, China and the EU have established a strategic relationship, and they've also had diplomatic relations, as I mentioned, for the last 5 decades. Annual trade has ballooned to just over $785 billion. What's been the main driver of this economic growth that we've seen?
Well, Anand, I think clearly the driver has been China's growth and development. So China, of course, started in the beginning of reform and opening with relatively low value-added goods, and it now has moved up the value chain and provides everything from rare earth metals, magnets, everything on that supply chain, to even frontier AI models like those provided by DeepSeek and Q1 from Alibaba. So I think clearly it's the growth and development of the Chinese economy and Chinese companies to develop globally competitive products and services. And of course, we can't leave out electric vehicles here as well. That, of course, is both been very good for European consumers, but also provides a point of tension between China and the EU.
Liang, the European countries are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The China-Europe Freight Rail Network is one of the BRI projects we were talking about it a moment ago, and it's really driven a trade between China and Europe. The network covers 128 Chinese cities, with trains recently exceeding 110,000 and has so far transported more than $450 billion in goods. So what is it? Give us some perspective on how important this rail network is, this connectivity between China and Europe.
Yeah, good to be with you, Anand. As you just mentioned, the two parts, the bilateral trade has gone up, from just close to $2 billion 5 decades ago to now over $780 billion. And when you think about it, that's like $2 billion of trade every day that is happening. And I think this kinds of infrastructure connectivity, like you mentioned, this China-EU freight trade, it's very important in bridging the two continents and to be able to really do a lot of businesses among the Asian economies, 11 countries in Asia and 26 countries in Europe, to establish this kind of trade connections. And of course, BRI is not just about building infrastructure, but also a lot of the investment commitments as well. The two-way FDI between the two have reached $260 billion in 2024. So there's a lot of areas for cooperation, not only trade and investment, but also science and technological development, people-to-people exchanges. Chinese tourists in Europe, for example, contributed greatly to the economy. There's also the cooperation areas now in, for example, central banking. Lagarde is right now in Beijing, and they have just signed the MOU to strengthen the cooperations on central banking and the reform of international monetary system, as well as, of course, global governance. So I think, trade and investments are definitely the building block for the two parts of connections, but it's far beyond that. I think really connects to both is this embracement of the open trade system, the multilateral system, the joint sort of global governance and cooperation and development. So I think that would really help to bond the two sides together.
So Liang, we're looking at the trade in goods, but you mentioned some of these services, the service industries. At this stage, do you think the relationship is ripe for a major expansion in that sector?
Absolutely. I think for one is, as I mentioned, tourism. According to the the Tourism Commission, they just did a recent survey, and 72% of the respondents said that they wanted to travel to Europe this summer, and that's a 10% up from last year. So I think tourism is one of them, but there's a lot of business services when it comes to, business consultancy, and also, as Andy talked about earlier, AI, technological sharing, and all of this I think will help to contribute to service, trade between the two.
Andy, I want to get back to something you just touched on a moment ago, and that's the current trade tensions between China and the European Union, the ongoing EU anti-subsidy probe into Chinese electric vehicles. That's almost resolved. The price commitment negotiations on EVs have now entered their final stage. Where do you see the negotiations going?
Well, I think the good news, Anand, is both sides certainly want to stabilize the relationship, manage disputes like this, and deepen the diplomatic engagement. And certainly, making progress in this area is very, very important. But I think it's also important to mention here that this is not purely a bilateral issue, that it is a trilateral issue, because we cannot ignore the role that the U.S. is playing. First of all, with its tariff maximalism, which affects both the EU and China, but the disruption in the traditional security relationship that seems to be happening. So I think this is creating both a force for cohesion, greater cooperation and flexibility between the EU and China, but I think it also introduced risks as well, because the US, of course, has threatened the EU about becoming too close with China. So I think we have to look at this a bit more holistically, and it is therefore, I think, very complex and very difficult to predict ultimately how this will play out.
And Andy, if we look at something specific like EV imports into Europe, the Europeans have just over 45% tariff on those imports. Is it likely after these negotiations that could be significantly lowered?
I certainly hope so, Anand, because again, there's a lot of emphasis, and rightly so, that the impact on European auto manufacturers. But at the same time, we have to recognize that this has been such a tremendous benefit for European consumers, with BYD in particular being able to offer high quality, well-designed, extremely economical EV offerings, at the lower end of their product range. So certainly it's good for consumers. I think most economists would agree that this is systemically a good thing. So it would make sense, I think, for the Europeans to find a way to strike the right balance.
All right, Yan Liang, looking at these negotiations, I mean, in response to those tariffs that I was talking about a moment ago, Beijing imposed curbs on dairy and brandy imports and recently extended its probe into Europe's pork imports to 6 months. I mean, in the brandy case, China is expected to issue its final ruling pretty soon. On July 5th, we should get that ruling. I mean, how do you view these sort of tit-for-tat measures that we're seeing?
Well, I think it is unfortunate. As I just mentioned, I think both sides really wanted to embrace multilateral system and open trade system. And both countries really benefit from this kinds of trade and investment cooperation. I think in the EV case, I understand that European countries want to protect the industries, but protectionism can only get you so far. As a matter of fact, I think, China has accelerated investment into EU. BYD, for example, has opened factories, right, in various countries like Hungary, and CATL has also opened factories in both Hungary and Germany, as well as Chery Auto has opened shops in Spain. So I think the kinds of direct investments and corporations in technologies would help to benefit both countries, and that would help to also increase the pie, increase the sales of EVs. That would benefit both countries, both sides as well. Not to mention, EU does have the commitment to phase out these, internal combustion engine cars by 2035. And so I think, with the cooperation with China, I think both countries would benefit from it. I think at this point, a lot of the Chinese anti-dumping probes into brandy, into pork are really, like you mentioned, tit for tat. And as a matter of fact, I think in recent days, we see that in recent weeks, China has seemed to really back down and show a lot more friendly gesture. They just delayed the final verdict on the probe into pork. They also pledged to accelerate the rare earth mineral exports to the European economies. So I think really what is important is bilateral dialogue on all these trade issues. And definitely, tensions could exist, disagreements could exist, but the best way is through these kinds of dialogues instead of tit-for-tat retaliation. Yeah. I think both sides are really coping with, the US's sort of assault in the international multilateral system. The EU's, the US's tariff on EU, if there's no deal, then this is going to shed 0.3 percentage points of their GDP growth rate. And that is significant. If you think about this year, they only forecast 0.9% of GDP growth rate. So I think, with this common challenge, it makes a lot more sense for both sides to cooperate rather than confront with each other.
And just briefly, you mentioned rare earth minerals, or rare earth metals, as they sometimes called. China says it will expedite the export of that from China to Europe. I mean, could that play a role in easing trade tensions?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is one of the tension points at this point. So in addition to EV and, as you mentioned, the probes into pork and brandy, there's also tensions about this rare earth mineral exports and as well as public procurement between the two. So I think, this is a good gesture that China is showing to EU that it's willing to normalize and accelerate, the trading relationships between the two, and to really, I think, plan ahead with the summit that is taking place in July between the two sides. And hopefully there will be a lot more cooperation in terms of, for example, the comprehensive investment agreements that was stalled at this point. So I think China is really willing to be able to continue with deepening the cooperation between the two. And I think that China is also maintaining very good relationships at this point, and to be able to manage the differences very well. And rare earth minerals, I think this is definitely important for global supply chain and various industries. And I think China is really willing to normalize relationships and to be able to facilitate, right, the kinds of global chain and global supply chain, the normal functioning of these.
Andy Mock, there was an interesting piece in the Global Times. It was written by Xu Hongjian, who is the director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. He suggested that China and Europe should focus on upgrading cooperation on smart manufacturing, green transition, the digital economy, as well as artificial intelligence. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's absolutely right, Anand. And in particular, if we focus on artificial intelligence, which is a general purpose technology and can drive advances in all of these other areas you mentioned, it's important to point out that open source models like DeepSeek, like Q1 from Alibaba and others from China offer a very, very important advantage in that they are open source, meaning that they're free to use. They can be modified, adapted by anyone. Now, Europe, of course, has some of its own, with Mistral being the most well-known frontier model that is also open source. But there's a couple of other factors as well. So DeepSeek is about 1/10 of the cost for inference compared to ChatGPT. These Chinese models are about 50-50 trained on an English corpus and a Chinese corpus, and this can have very, very important implications for cross-border activity, trade, investment, other types of activities. And then finally, these DeepSeek in particular has been designed in a way to facilitate regulatory compliance, especially with the EU AI Act. So I see this as a very, very important area that can bring China and the EU closer together. That being said, I think there are also structural risks on the EU side because, again, the range of diversities, and especially with the recent EU Parliament elections, with a greater range, especially some of these more far-right nationalist voices, that might make it more difficult to move forward. But to your question, Anand, absolutely. I think technological cooperation with artificial intelligence as its base and using open source models like DeepSeek that bring cost advantages, cross-border language advantages as well, I think are going to be a very factor.
Okay, Liang, got a little bit of time left, but I'm going to look at one issue, one area of potential cooperation between the two sides, which is outside of trade and economics, and that is the issue of climate change, the battle against climate change. The French Minister for Ecological Transition, Agnès Pannier-Runacher, was recently in Beijing to mark the 10th anniversary of the Paris Accords, and this is what she had to say. Let's listen.
Last March, with my colleague Jean-Noël Barrot, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Europe, we reaffirmed our shared commitment to climate multilateralism by signing this joint climate declaration with China. And I hope that this momentum will intensify, that we will turn our commitments into results, our ambitions into tangible cooperation. China is today a key player in the global energy transition. It is a strategic partner, just like the European Union, in the fight against climate change.
So, Liang, can China and the EU actually now take the lead in this battle against climate change, given that the United States has now withdrawn again from the Paris Accords?
Well, yes, I think it's both a necessity, but also I think a lot of the conditions are sufficient for the two sides to be able to cooperate and really lead on the climate change front. I think China has contributed a lot in terms of both its own installation of renewable energies, but also in terms of its formidable industrial capacity to be able to manufacture, solar panels and battery storages at a very low cost, at a very large scale. And it's able to also share its technologies, and also, I think very importantly, some of the policy initiatives that has really helped successfully for China to accelerate its green transition. So I think for both sides, when they have this strong commitment and also the spirit of cooperation, I think they will accomplish a lot, even with the exit of the second largest emitter of the United States.
Right, and talking about accomplishing a lot, Liang, the European Council President, Antonio Costa, as well as the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, will be in China, possibly next month, for a meeting there. What are expectations? Are you hopeful there'll be something very positive coming out of it?
Well, I certainly hope so. We have seen a lot more dialogues and a lot more communications between the two sides. The Common Secretary Wang Wentao just met with Paris' counterparts, and as I mentioned earlier, that Lagarde is right now in China and talking with Pan Gongsheng, the central banker in China. And so with a lot more of these dialogues to be able to overcome the differences and disagreements, I think that both sides will be able to make great progress in terms of the trade relationships, investment, science, technological exchanges, people-to-people exchanges, central banking, cooperations, as well as global governance issues, fighting climate change, and so on and so forth.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Liang, Andy Mok, thanks to both of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.